United we play, united we win.
Deep right field, another absolute bomb over the flag court.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
Minus 15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff. Annie, I was going to open this podcast with talking about our rec soccer team in Pathetico Madrid giving yet another Pathetico performance, a 3-1 loss. You had the only goal.
It's because you weren't playing, Brendan.
I will say, in the 2 games that I have either been injured mid-game or just not able to play in the game, we are 0-2. And last season we were great, and I was playing all season. So I'm not going to say there's a direct correlation.
There's not.
Correlation might equal causation there. But as I was thinking about what to open this podcast with, we were just chatting as we do, and we came to the revelation that you don't know the Muppets at all. Okay. Annie named one Muppet, and it was Miss Piggy. Upon trying to name a second Muppet, your answer was Muppet.
No, I said
it was.
I said Grouch. That
Our
was the
producer,
second
Bobby
one.
Blanco, would back me up on that,
I
that your
said-
answer was Muppet.
Actually, it was Grouch, and then I got to Muppet. But my thing is, I apparently was mixing up Sesame Street characters and Muppets characters. Muppets plural, Muppet.
Sure.
Muppets plural.
No, I'm going to let you try to figure that out.
But on Google, they are one in the same. So that is my, the conclusion I've come to is that I'm correct because I got Cookie Monster, Oscar the Grouch
But
eventually.
that's a little bit cheating because
And
Sesame Street characters,
Kermit.
everybody knows that Sesame Street characters are technically Muppets, but different than the Muppets. Like
Everyone knows
it's
this?
the same. Everybody knows this.
All right.
This is a common knowledge thing. What other Muppets do you know outside of Miss Piggy? We're not talking Sesame Street characters, just Muppets. Kermit. Yeah, we gave you that one after you said Muppet,
And that's it.
and that's it.
Big Bird, if you count Sesame Street.
I
and
do not.
Muppets the same thing.
No Fozzie Bear? No Gonzo? No Animal?
They sound
That's-
familiar.
That's insanity.
Well, throw your answers in the chat if you think that Sesame Street and Muppets are the same because
You're getting off on a technicality, and that's we just shouldn't do that.
okay. Well, anyways.
Anyway,
Pardon my lack of Muppeteer knowledge.
yeah. Well, that's that's a red flag. And if we're being honest,
How sad.
we have a lot of Orioles news to get to today. We are going to be power ranking the Orioles' positional needs heading into the offseason, but we have a lot of news and notes to get to first. First off, Corbin Burnes and Anthony Santander officially rejected their qualifying offers. This was always going to happen. We talked about it a few weeks ago that the Orioles had extended those qualifying offers to Burnes and Santander. More often than not, a player that is going to get a multi-year deal is going to reject their qualifying offer because the qualifying offer is just a one-year deal worth however much. There was only one player in baseball that accepted their qualifying offer this year. That was Reds pitcher Nick Martinez. But Burnes and Santander reject that qualifying offer. The reason you extend that offer, knowing that they are going to reject it anyway, is because if a player rejects their qualifying offer and then signs a multi-year deal elsewhere, if it hits a certain money threshold, then the team that loses that player is able to get a draft pick. So if Burnes and Santander sign elsewhere for big money deals, the Orioles could get draft picks in return because those guys rejected the qualifying offer.
Yeah, and there's still a chance and a glimmer of hope that the O's sign either or both of those team players. I think it's a little bit unlikely. But back to the Orioles for a longer and larger deal. So it's not end-all, be-all now that they've declined these qualifying offers. However, if you do get both of those compensation draft picks, that would be huge, especially knowing how the Orioles tend to draft and their success in the draft. But also because you did not get a draft pick for AL Rookie of the Year this year. Colton Cowser did not get that. Unlike last year when the Orioles got one through Gunnar Henderson winning AL Rookie of the Year. So that was on the on the radar, on the horizon if Colton Cowser were to win that award again this year. So if Santander and Burns do decide to go elsewhere, getting those 2 compensation draft picks would be huge.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Colton Cowser losing AL Rookie of the Year to Luis Heel. It was an incredibly tight race. Heel finishes with 106 points in voting, Cowser with 101. Heel had 2 more first-place votes. Cowser was actually on the ballot more than Luis Heel. He had 11 second-place votes to Heel's 10, 3 third-place votes to Heel's 1. There were some stray first-place votes to Mason Miller and Cade Smith, the reliever for the Guardians. Those would have been nice to go to Colton Cowser because he would have won AL Rookie of the Year in that case. But Cowser's still a fantastic rookie season. Just a bummer that you miss out on the draft pick compensation. But you're right. If Burns and Santander go elsewhere, the Orioles are very good at drafting, and getting 2 comp picks for those guys going elsewhere would be huge. Other news to get to: Brandon Young and Cade Stroud added to the Orioles 40-man roster yesterday. It was the deadline for protecting players from the Rule 5 draft, so Young and Stroud cannot be selected in that draft now. If you remember, that's where the Orioles got Tyler Wells, Anthony Santander a bunch of years ago. Brandon Young was really the only lock among players that had to be protected. He was the Orioles minor league pitcher of the year last year. He was a starting option in AAA as we got down the stretch, and the Orioles were continuously hit by injuries in the starting rotation. Brandon Hyde mentioned Brandon Young. Michael Elias did as well, as a potential starting option down the stretch, so Brandon Young wouldn't be surprised if he is at least in the conversation for a starting rotation spot to open up the year and a roster spot with the Orioles to break spring training. Cade Stroud, ERA wasn't great in AAA, but it's over 13 Ks per 9, and that's what the Orioles are going to look at.
Yeah, Stroud definitely more of a stuff guy, and I think the Orioles saw that and knew they wanted and needed to protect him. I think both goes for both Brandon Young and Cade Stroud, that they have signs of hope for these guys, and they definitely believe in them making big league potential one day, and that's definitely the whole reason of the Rule 5 kind of being able to protect those guys before they reach that draft. So Brandon Young, I think we definitely see a lot more potential in him, but I think both of which will continue to go through the motions of player development, farm system beforehand, and just see where it goes, because I think there is big potential for both of them, Brandon Young more so, but I'm excited to see what happens from both of them.
Yeah, a couple of names that the Orioles did not protect that in their top 30 prospects that are now eligible for the Rule 5 draft: Juan Nunez, Alex Pham, a couple of starting pitchers, Keegan Gillies, a reliever who is one of the Orioles' top prospects, but he is just a reliever. Wouldn't be surprised if he gets claimed in the Rule 5 draft, because a lot of teams go after reliever types that they can just throw in the back of the bullpen. And then Hudson Haskin as well was an Orioles second-round pick a few years ago, has struggled with injuries in AAA, hasn't really found his footing at that level yet. So Hudson Haskin goes unprotected as well. He has been unprotected in the past too. So Haskin was not selected previously. Would be surprised if Haskin is selected this year. But Juan Nunez, Alex Pham, two pitchers that aren't highly advanced in terms of level. They haven't gotten up to AAA Norfolk yet, but they do have a lot of good stuff. So a team could take a chance on them and just try to hide them on the roster somewhere, but that's a risk, especially on the pitching side of things. One final piece of news to get to. Mike Elias announced that the Orioles are moving the left field wall again. They're pushing it further back. No, they're not. They're bringing it back in. Mike Elias said, look, they overcorrected a little bit. Left field wall at Camden Yards before they pushed it back was really easy to hit home runs. It was one of the most hitter-friendly parks in all of baseball. They moved the left field wall back, and they moved it way back. And there were a bunch of instances over the past few seasons where you would see home run in 29 out of 30 ballparks, and the only ballpark was Camden Yards, where it stayed in. So I'm sure the right-handed hitters on this team are happy about it. I'm sure the pitchers aren't thrilled about it, but the Orioles get back to a little bit more of an average wall in left field versus a behemoth of a wall that nobody can hit over.
Yeah, Mike Elias called it more of a reaching a happier medium, so it definitely makes a lot more sense. MASN's Rock Kubatko threw out a good piece today that kind of hits on the O's hitters that would be most impacted by bringing it back in, notably Ryan Mountcastle. So keep an eye out for that piece to read a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I think right-handed hitters are happy about it. I don't think this changes a ton in terms of Orioles moves or Orioles philosophy of drafting a lot of left-handed hitters or anything like that. Maybe it's a little bit more of an incentive if you are a right-handed hitter coming to Camden Yards because you don't want your power numbers to take an incredible dip. I don't think it makes that much of a difference if you are a potential starting pitcher looking at Camden Yards. Maybe a little bit if you're a lefty, but I don't think a ton. It's really, again, just going from a left field wall that was the furthest back in baseball to a little bit more average. So it doesn't change a ton there, but I do think it will get Camden Yards back to a more even playing field on all sides. Right field, still a little bit short, is still a little bit of a short porch for left-handed hitters to hit home runs there, and then left field getting back to more of a league average there. All right, Annie, let's get into our power rankings here. We have each come up with a top 5 in terms of what position groups the Orioles should target this offseason. I think there are some pretty clear ones. We will probably have similarities with our 3, 2, and 1 because those are obvious holes. The Orioles don't have a ton of obvious holes. It's really just the ones that we will get to here in a bit. So 5 and 4, I think, are interesting in terms of what our power rankings here might look like. I'll go first with my number 5, and that is just starting pitching depth. I think the top starting pitcher is a priority that we will get to down the line as we go higher up our power rankings here, but you need depth in the starting rotation. And right now, with the rotation, you have Cade Povich, Trevor Rogers, Chase McDermott, Albert Suarez. One of those guys is probably going to need to start the season in the rotation if you don't sign another number 4, number 5 guy on top of whatever number 1, number 2, number 3 you are hopefully bringing in as well. I think Cade Povich would be fine in that number 5 spot. I think Trevor Rogers has upside as well. The Orioles clearly traded for him for a reason. I think you're fine with either of those guys as your 5th starter. But the real reason that I think pitching depth is just important to bring in is because it's just always important to bring in. Mike Elias has talked about it year after year. 2 years ago, the Orioles got really lucky in their starting rotation. They did not need a lot of guys to get through the season. And this year, it was an unfortunate regression to the mean, where the Orioles needed 13 guys to make a start this year. And that's a lot. And if you say, okay, the Orioles are going to sign one guy at the top of the rotation, Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, Dean Kramer, Cade Povich, Trevor Rogers, Chase McDermott, Albert Suarez, Tyler Wells, maybe a Brandon Young, that only brings you to 10. So I would like to see the Orioles bring in one more starting pitcher. Doesn't necessarily have to even be a big league deal. It can be a minor league deal, an Albert Suarez type, somebody who can bounce between AAA and the majors and be a potential number 5 spot starter if you need him. Maybe a long man out of the bullpen, a right-handed complement to Keegan Aiken, who can either give you 3-4 innings at a time out of the pen or be a starting pitcher for you that would bring your starting options to around 11, 12. And I think that would be a safe place for the Orioles to be.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think this is going to be the only thing that we kind of disagree on throughout these power rankings. Not necessarily that pitching depth isn't a priority, because I think that it is a priority. But my disagreement here is that I think pitching depth is a higher priority than my number 5, which is a bullpen piece, because you already do have a really strong bullpen, especially if you do get Felix Bautista coming back at his peak level of performance like he was before getting injured. So having him back is going to be great. You do hope for the best that he is the same Felix Bautista as before. And then you also have Sir Anthony Dominguez, who's going to be a great setup man for Bautista, and some other great depth, either in Yennier Cano, Jacob Webb, Albert Suarez, if he is moved into the bullpen next season. But also some lefties in Keegan Aiken, Cionel Perez, and Gregory Soto. I do think that this is still a priority to bring in another bullpen piece, and specifically another lefty, having not gotten Danny Coulomb and where the club declined his $4 million option. I do think it is important to bring in another lefty bullpen piece to kind of fill in those shoes for Danny Coulomb, because he was a really important piece of this bullpen when he came back from injury this year in the beginning of the season as well. However, I would rank it a little bit lesser of a priority than pitching depth.
Yeah, I have to disagree with you there because I have lefty bullpen option at number 4. And you mentioned the fact that the Orioles have 3 lefties in the bullpen in Keegan Aiken, Cionel Perez, Gregory Soto. Losing Danny Coulombe, again, it is possible that Danny Coulombe is back on a lesser money deal than the Orioles, declining their $4 million option there. But I think you have solid pieces in Cionel Perez and Gregory Soto. Soto especially was excellent down the stretch for the Orioles last year. Cionel Perez and Gregory Soto are streaky pitchers. When they get hot, they are hot for a while. I mean, Cionel Perez was fantastic in the month of August. He had a stretch where he looked like maybe your most reliable lefty bullpen piece. Gregory Soto was really, really good down the stretch after a few games when he first got to Baltimore where he was pretty rough. But those 2 guys are still really streaky. And Keegan Aiken is more of a long man. And so when I look at the back end of the Orioles bullpen, I still think you need a higher leverage lefty bullpen piece. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Tanner Scott. I mean, that would be really nice. But look, I am as hopeful as anybody that Felix Bautista is back at the beginning of the year in his closer role and looks fantastic. I also think it's possible that it takes a little bit of time for Bautista to ramp up, in which case you would probably need a little bit of closer by committee just for a little while until Bautista gets his feet back under him, which would probably be Felix Bautista, Sir Anthony Dominguez, Gregory Soto, some combination of those 3 closing games. I think you need one more lefty at the back end of the bullpen to go along with Perez and Soto just because of how streaky those guys can be. And you hope it doesn't happen that they are just on a downturn at the same time during the season. Bullpen arms in general fluctuate a lot throughout the year. And so I think if you're only relying on Cionel Perez and Gregory Soto as your high leverage lefties, it doesn't leave you with a ton of options given those 2, given their track record over the past few years. So I have lefty bullpen option at number 4. Like I said, I don't think it needs to be a Tanner Scott. I think if you went and got a Scott Alexander and Andrew Chafin type, those guys have a proven track record. They would be solid 6th, 7th, 8th inning guys if needed. Just another lefty arm to rotate in with Perez and Soto down the stretch.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with your statements. However, I think putting pitching depth at number 5 as a priority, or at number 4 as a priority ahead of getting another lefty bullpen piece, I think if there's one thing that we learned from this season is that pitching injuries hit the Orioles like a truck this year.
Yeah.
And I think that the more depth that you get leading up to it, you can kind of set yourself up way better than you did this previous season because that came out of nowhere, one, and it was very unexpected. And you had to kind of rely on your Cade Poviches and your Albert Suarez. And yes, they showed up very well in big moments throughout the season. But I think that my priority is getting some more pitching depth so that you don't have to worry about that again this season. So I think I totally agree with everything there. It's just a little bit of workshopping.
Yeah, I think it's possible, too, that the Orioles just bring in a number 5 type of pitcher and they compete with Cade Povich and Trevor Rogers for the 5th spot in this rotation because we are operating under the assumption that the Orioles bring in another, either an ace, somebody like Corbin Burns, Max Fried, or a number 2, number 3 type. And then that number 5 rotation spot would be up for grabs between Povich, McDermott, Rogers, somebody else that they potentially bring in. The Orioles are hoping that Tyler Wells and Kyle Bradish are back mid-season, but you can't rely on them certainly for the beginning of the season. And you don't want to bank on 2 guys coming back from injury as the guys for the entire season. You can treat them like deadline acquisitions. Maybe they come back in June or July and are excellent, and that would be a huge boost to your team. But I don't think you can say, okay, going into the season, we just need a stopgap to Kyle Bradish and Tyler Wells because we saw what happened last year with, John Means was coming back and you were hopeful that he was good to go, and then all of a sudden he wasn't again. Kyle Bradish, injured in spring training, hoped that he could push through. He was there for a bit, injured again. So you need to bring in, I think, I agree with you. I think you should bring in somebody for that number 4, number 5 spot to compete with Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Trevor Rogers, because you're going to need that depth anyway.
Yeah, and for those young guys like Cade Povich and Chase McDermott, I think it is really important to have someone that is pushing them to where, okay, the Orioles just brought in someone for their number 5 starter. I need to work harder and make sure that I prove myself that I'm worthy for that spot in this team. And I think that's going to be huge for Cade and Chase and even Brandon Young to kind of light some fire under them a little bit. And I think that would be really great for them to work for that spot even more than they are.
Yeah, and just from a clubhouse perspective, you could use another veteran pitcher. The Orioles are always in need of some good veterans in this clubhouse because the core is so young. And I don't think there would be anything wrong with bringing in a veteran number 5 type of guy who is just a good depth piece, can eat some innings if you need him to, and is there if injuries occur. Our top 3 position groups in our power rankings, I would imagine, are probably the same and probably in the same order. But
I think so too.
Let's go through them anyway. At number 3, because the position groups are pretty similar, I got very specific with my needs for the Orioles here. At number 3, I have veteran 1-year deal backup catcher. I think, look, we have talked about it before in terms of whether or not we wanted to bring James McCann back into the fold. James McCann is a free agent. He was a very good backup catcher. Samuel Basallo is in AAA, and he needs more seasoning there. He is just going into his age 20 season. He only had about 20 games with the Tides. He is going to be an excellent big league player at some point. I don't know if he is going to debut this season. I would imagine that maybe we see him in August or maybe earlier if he continues to light the world on fire. But Basallo probably needs to just get some more work defensively. He has put in a ton of work on that side of the ball this past year. He is going to be up eventually, but you need somebody in the meantime. This isn't a high priority position group in terms of the pure on the field value that they are bringing, because whoever you sign to a 1-year deal to be Adley Rutschman's backup is going to be just that. They are Adley Rutschman's backup. They're not going to get a ton of playing time, maybe some occasional reps at DH here and there. They're mostly just going to be in the clubhouse to get Adley Rutschman off of his feet. James McCann did an excellent job of that over the past few seasons in Baltimore. So you just need really a James McCann type of player to be a kind of a stopgap catcher until Samuel Basallo is up in the bigs and ready to go. I think it makes a lot of sense to bring in a veteran that works well with the pitching staff, that can get Adley off his feet as a designated hitter every once in a while. Again, James McCann makes sense. Somebody like Jacob Stallings, Kyle Higashioka, that archetype of player.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I think it would be really awesome to see James McCann brought back as well. Just because we talked about this last week on the podcast, but he is the ultimate clubhouse piece and leader for this team. Just a really, really great kind of influence on the young guys. I mean, incredible grit. We know that for sure. But he was also there, you're right, to provide not only defensive replacement for Adley Rutschman, but also he was there at times later in the season for offensive replacement as well. Whether that was in September hitting .324. I do think that you do need a backup catcher for Adley for sure coming up for this next season. I mean, the O's did bring in Rene Pinto from the Rays, but I do still think that it is a need to get another backup catcher, whether that is McCann or those other guys like Stallings that you mentioned.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be a massive contract anywhere. I think you can bring in a catcher on a 1-year deal,
right?
$2, $3, $4 million. I think that is the type of player that makes sense. Somebody who is able to come in, they know that they are going to operate as Adley Rutschman's backup, but they are still going to get some decent playing time. I mean, we saw James McCann a lot last year when the Orioles were trying to get Adley Rutschman off his feet as much as possible. So it's still a catcher that's going to get 80-plus games, I would imagine, throughout the season. My number 2, and again, what I would imagine is probably also your number 2, is a right-handed or switch-hitting middle-of-the-order outfielder. Anthony Santander is a free agent. He is very good. You need somebody to try to replace his production. Now, whether that is replacing him with a player that platoons with Heston Kjerstad or somebody who starts every day, I think that's the decision the Orioles will have to make. Right now, Colton Cowser and Cedric Mullins are pretty much everyday starters. I think you can make a case that you could bring in a right-handed hitting outfielder that could also play center field, that could platoon with Cedric Mullins a little bit as well. Heston Kjerstad, I think you can make the argument that as one of the better outfield prospects in all of baseball and somebody that who we have seen a lot of good flashes from, he could be your starting right fielder heading into next season. I think he would be okay with that, but I think you need to supplement that production as well. As mentioned, I think you could bring in somebody like Randall Grichuk or Tyler O'Neill, a right-handed hitting outfielder that can play multiple positions, that can platoon with Heston Kjerstad with that right-left split. Or you could also go after somebody like Teoscar Hernandez, who would be a right-handed hitting outfielder that would start every day for you, regardless of matchup. Maybe Kjerstad would platoon with Teo a little bit, but I think Hernandez would get a majority of the starts there. But you need some more power in the middle of the lineup, and I think it needs to be a right-handed bat. You have a lot of good left-handed options. You have Colton Cowser in the middle of the lineup. Adley Rutschman probably in the middle of the lineup. Ryan O'Hearn. There are lefties that will consistently bat in the middle of the lineup. Heston Kjerstad, when he's in the lineup, should be there as well. On the right-handed side, you really just have Adley, Westberg, Mountcastle, maybe somebody like a Kobe Mayo, but that's, he's going to have to earn a spot in the middle of the lineup for next year, certainly. I think you need somebody that is going to come close to replicating Anthony Santander's production. Nobody's going to give you 44 home runs again, unless somebody like Teoscar Hernandez comes in and has a career year. But you could bring in an outfielder like a Tyler O'Neill that hits 18 home runs and Heston Kjerstad hits 18 home runs, and all of a sudden you're getting closer to what Anthony Santander was giving you. No matter which direction the Orioles go in, with a everyday starter or a platoon type of bat, you need somebody that fits that profile.
Yeah, now, I know I said that if there was one thing that we learned from last season is that pitching depth was a need. But the other thing that we learned from this past season was that they needed some depth in right-handed hitting, and especially, we saw it. It was a clear need at the trade deadline, so they went out and got Austin Slater, who did help in times of trouble, either if that was when there were offensive slumps or injuries throughout the lineup as a whole. But the biggest thing, too, the stipulation that I do want to put on this, because we have the same number 2 priority, a right-handed hitting outfielder, but I do want to emphasize that a veteran bat is needed for sure. And I think you mentioned Teoscar Hernandez. Yes, you could go out and get him, but also he's already won a World Series. Maybe he would like to help a younger team in that same venture, but to get that kind of veteran experience in the postseason is something that the O's definitely needed down the stretch this season and the year before that. Also, Jurickson Profar from the Padres, switch hitter, 6 years in the American League when he started in MLB. So I think that is also kind of someone you could target to fill that switch hitter role if you do lose Anthony Santander, but also with that veteran experience. Even though he's projected how much he wants to stay in San Diego, I think that could be a great option to look out for. But also, I think people around the block have said it's starting to feel a little bit more likely that Anthony Santander could come back, and I'm not sure exactly how that will play out, but it would be great to get him back as well, just because of who he is for this club.
Yeah, Santander clearly loved it here, and it's possible that he would take a little bit of a hometown discount to stay in Baltimore as well. He is a good player, and I don't want to discount the possibility of bringing back Anthony Santander in this conversation, because he is giving you a lot of the production that somebody like Teoscar Hernandez or Tyler O'Neill would give you. You would like to see the batting average and on-base percentage go up for Santander. But look, if the 44 home runs goes down to 35 and the on-base percentage goes up from 308 to 325, you take that player every day. I take that player over 44 home runs every day of the week. So that's what we're talking about with somebody like Teoscar Hernandez, who, the batting average is going to be higher, closer to 275. The on-base percentage is going to be a little bit higher. But if Santander hits some more home runs, gets the on-base percentage up a little bit. That's a really valuable player. And he stayed healthy last year. He improved in right field defensively. Santander is still a very good possibility as somebody that you could look at in right field. He fits the profile of somebody that the Orioles need. At number 1 in my power rankings here, I would imagine it is the same as yours again. That is high-end starting pitcher. We have already talked about the Orioles' need for pitching depth because you have Kyle Bradish and Tyler Wells on the mend. Won't be back until midseason. Makes sense to bring in a number 5 type of guy. It also makes a lot of sense to bring in a number 1, number 2 type of pitcher as well. Corbin Burns is a free agent. He was really good. You would like to bring in somebody, of course, in an ideal world, you would like to bring back Corbin Burns. He is the best pitcher available. He was really, really good in Baltimore. He gave you everything you needed and hoped for when the Orioles made that trade last offseason. That you would be very happy leaving with Corbin Burns this offseason. He is in most normal offseasons that don't include Juan Soto, Corbin Burns would be the prize. He is the best starting pitcher available. There are also guys like Max Fried that you could go after. You don't necessarily have a true ace in this rotation right now. Zach Eflin and Grayson Rodriguez profile as, I think, good number 2 options. Grayson Rodriguez has ace potential, and he flashed that last season. He's not there quite yet. Kyle Bradish has also flashed ace type of potential, but you still have to see what you have from him coming back, and you won't get him until midseason. So there's not really a true number 1 workhorse type of guy. That being said, you could also bring in somebody like a Sean Manaea, who is also a number 2, number 3 type of pitcher, and then you just have down the stretch like 4 number 2 options in Zach Eflin, Manaea, Grayson, and Kyle Bradish. I think that would be a direction that makes sense as well. But you need somebody with high upside at the top of this rotation, because as solid as Zach Eflin and Grayson Rodriguez are, I think if they are your number 2 and number 3 starters versus your number 1 and number 2, you feel a lot better going into the year.
Yeah, I was going to make a joke that I disagreed with the number 1 priority and that it's a utility infielder, but then I realized that was a bad joke. So I am sticking with, yes, I think an ace specifically is the top priority for the O's in the offseason. I mean, just seeing how crucial Corbin Burns was after they went out and got him in the offseason last year, that should be all the reason to tell you that this is the number 1 priority. Because if you do lose someone like Burns, sure, there might not be that many options to fully replace the capabilities that Burns brought this team. But I do think that that is someone you look to kind of fill that number 1 spot so that you're not relying on Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, Dean Kramer in whatever order. I think that that is doable, but you do want someone of Corbin Burns' caliber to fill that number 1 spot. I also think that there are some great lefty options on the market, especially if you kind of make that assumption that Trevor Rogers won't be in the starting rotation from opening day, then grab a lefty and put him in those 5 spots. And Blake Snell is a lefty, Max Fried, Sean Manaea, Yusei Kikuchi, you could go that route. I think that there's also the option, kind of another area of conversation, is how the Orioles decide to go and get a starting pitcher. Like Corbin Burns, where last year they traded 2 top prospects for him. I don't necessarily think that is going to be the route that the Orioles take. Ken Rosenthal of The Athletic said, while the Orioles are one of many teams in the mix for Chicago White Sox left-hander Garrett Crochet, they currently are more focused on free agency, according to sources briefed on their discussions. And I do think that is the route we will see, given the new ownership and kind of wanting to make a splash.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think that makes the most sense from this point on for the Orioles, because the farm system is still really solid. It is still probably a top 10 farm system in baseball. It is not the same farm system that it was in seasons past. Because you have called up a lot of the top guys in the system. Jackson Holliday is not a prospect anymore. Colton Cowser is not a prospect anymore. Heston Kjerstad's not a prospect anymore. A lot of those top guys are here, and that's great. That is one of the primary goals of the farm system. But they've also accomplished the other primary goal of the farm system, which is to develop prospects that are valuable for other teams. You trade them away, you get talent. We saw that last offseason with Corbin Burns. And yes, while you didn't have the postseason success, that was still a great trade. But yeah, you mentioned the lefties as a possibility. I think Corbin Burns is one of one. If you can't get him, there are other good options to pivot towards. Max Fried and Blake Snell is a very interesting discussion because they are both really good lefties that are going to command long-term deals. Incredibly different pitchers.
Yeah.
Max Fried is in the 96th percentile in ground ball rate, which I think makes a lot of sense with an athletic Orioles defense behind him. When healthy, it is a Jordan Westberg, Gunnar Henderson, Jackson Holliday / Jorge Mateo at second base, Ryan Mountcastle, a Gold Glove finalist at first base. That is a really good, athletic, young infield. And Max Fried would make a lot of sense as an Orioles target there. And then you have Blake Snell, who's in the 98th percentile in just about everything on StatCast, but strikeout percentage specifically. So it would be interesting to see if the Orioles are going after those two guys, which type of pitcher they tend to go after. Is it the guy like Fried that's going to put the ball on the ground a lot and still get a lot of outs, or Blake Snell, who turns into the best pitcher on the planet in the second half of the season and just strikes everybody out? But I think we are in agreement there that it feels like a pretty large gap between number 2 and number 3 in terms of the Orioles' priorities, and then a massive gap between number 3 and number 4. Because there are really 3 holes that the Orioles have. Top of the rotation, power bat, preferably right-handed in the outfield or a switch hitter, and then the veteran backup catcher. Those are the 3 holes on the team right now. And then I think with number 4 and number 5, we had as a lefty bullpen option and starting pitching depth. Still probably a need, but if you go through this offseason, you don't have those things, it's not the end of the world. You just would like to bring those things in. Were there any position groups for you, Annie, that just missed your top 5 in your power rankings outside of the utility infielder joke that you almost had at number 1?
The really poor joke that I threw in there, but didn't also throw in there. I mean, I think that you could make the argument for, there's rumors swirling around that, okay, Ryan Mountcastle could be used as a trade piece for the Orioles. So, and you do have Ryan O'Hearn back, but if you kind of lose that first baseman, is that kind of a hole, but I don't think it necessarily is, which is why it was left out. And I think because you do have so many star infielders that can, move from every spot in the infield, that it isn't necessarily a big need, especially with Kobe Mayo as well. And I'm really looking forward to seeing him getting some more playing time in the big leagues, and whether that he's on the opening day roster or not. But that one was left out of my top 5 priorities.
Yeah, certainly if there's a trade made involving big league talent, that modifies the top 5 pretty drastically. There were a few other position groups for me that I considered. First one being a right-handed center fielder, somebody to platoon with Cedric Mullins. I think there's a possibility that that's just Jorge Mateo. Sure. Because Jorge Mateo, I think, will get some work at second base still as a platoon option with Jackson Holliday, assuming that he is healthy and good to go. He has also shown quality flashes defensively in center field as well. So I think Jorge Mateo could just stick around as a defense-first type of option to get some run at second base and at center field as well. Utility infielder, I think that's pretty much covered by Ramon Urias and Jorge Mateo. They were both solid last year. They can play pretty much everywhere outside of shortstop. And Kobe Mayo kind of fits into that conversation, but he's more of a third base, first base hybrid, and he's probably not going to be playing any second base or certainly shortstop.
Yeah.
So Kobe Mayo, not really a utility infielder, but works into that conversation. Same thing goes for utility outfielder. I think that role is kind of filled by Heston Kjerstad, by Jorge Mateo, by whoever else you bring in. Right now, there's really just 3 outfielders on the 40-man that we would project to make the opening day roster. Daz Cameron is on the 40-man as well, but right now, it's just Kjerstad, Mullins, Cowser. We are assuming that there will be another outfielder brought in to supplement those guys, and I think Jorge Mateo is kind of your 5th-ish outfielder as a second base center field hybrid that can also probably play a corner if he needed him to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it'd also be interesting to kind of see how recent draft picks develop this coming season, because you do have that kind of outfield depth that's there in the farm system, definitely will not, at least very unlikely that they make a major league appearance like Enrique Bradfield Jr. or Vance Honeycutt. Definitely have a few more years in the making there, but there is that kind of, we talk about the farm system looks a lot different after this trade deadline and the offseason trades made last season, but there is that kind of outfield depth that we could see for the outfield utility way further down the road as well.
Yeah, down the line, you're looking at Bradfield and Honeycutt as the two, guys that could be starters for a while. Dylan Beavers, Judd Fabian are two names to look at that should be in AAA Norfolk to start the season. I'd imagine Judd Fabian got 30 games with the Tides, struggled. I think Dylan Beavers, there's a good chance that he starts the year with AAA Norfolk as well. But I think if you're looking at potential depth pieces in the outfield, Judd Fabian, Dylan Beavers, probably not two prospects that you're counting on to come in and make a huge impact. I think really the only ones that you were looking at are Kobe Mayo and Samuel Basayo, if you're looking at the Orioles top 30. But Dylan Beavers, Judd Fabian, both could work into that outfield conversation as potential depth pieces, not guys that you would really be counting on to make a huge impact and splash down the stretch unless one of them has a great start in Norfolk, and then all of a sudden that conversation changes. Whew. Covered a lot today. A lot of news, a lot of notes, but I think that'll just about do it for this week's edition of The Bird's Nest. We're going to be off next week. It's the day before Thanksgiving. Go enjoy the holidays. We will be back the week after that. I think it's the first week in December. Next month or so with the holidays, we're going to be a little bit in and out, but we're going to keep bringing you all of your Orioles off-season coverage, so make sure you are staying locked in to The Bird's Nest. We are live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on YouTube and Facebook, or you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts or your digital shows. You can find us here on The Bird's Nest. Big thank you to Bobby Blanco behind the scenes for producing this one. For Annie Klaff, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.